Hello, and thank you for joining us to learn about the QuoteWerks Layout Designer. A quote in QuoteWerks is made up of an enormous amount of data. Our customers don't need to see all of the data that we see in QuoteWerks, and they may need it organized in a way that emphasizes just the right information, while also maintaining our brand identity. The QuoteWerks Layout Designer is used to define how the data in a QuoteWerks document will be organized into pages and presented to a potential customer. To understand the Layout Designer, let's first define the core components and how they behave during the printing process. We'll preview the document with an empty print layout. This is an example of a completely bare starting point. All we see on the layout are 5 empty sections, and when we preview the document, we'll get an empty page, regardless of what we have on the quote. Let's start with a brief explanation of the 5 sections. The report headers are printed first and just once, so they represent the very top of the printed document. A layout can have up to 9 different report headers, but we'll talk more about that later. The report headers are often used for company branding, including company logos, banners, or a company motto. They're also used to print preliminary quote details that only need to appear once. Information like the quote number, expiration date, customer information, or introduction notes. The page header is printed immediately after the report headers and then again at the beginning of each page. Only one page header can be defined in the layout, and it is usually used to define column headings that will be printed at the top of each page. It can also be used for other incidental header information like a company logo, company motto, or page numbers if they are needed at the top of every page. The detail sections are the real heart of the print layout. Up to 18 detail sections can be defined in a layout, and they are used to define how line items are organized on the printed document. We'll talk much more about the detail sections in a bit. The report footers print at the end of the report, specifically just after the final line item is printed by the detail sections. The layout can include up to 9 report footers, and they're often used for summarizing the document with information like subtotal, sales tax, and grand total. It's also used as a good place for closing notes or a friendly phrase like "thank you for your business." The page footer defines a footer that is printed at the bottom of every page. Like the page header, only one page footer can be defined, and it will be printed on every page, so it's a great place to put page numbers for your quote. All of these sections have a variety of settings and properties associated with them. An important setting to be aware of at this point is the section filter. Here we can define a condition that must be met for this section to print. We'll talk more about this later because there are so many different ways to use the section filters. But constructing the filter criteria is very similar to constructing a formula field. We'll need to think about these filter settings when we consider what's going to print on our document. Now let's take a look at a full print layout and walk through the printing process. To understand what will ultimately print on the document and where, let's walk through the steps of the basic QuoteWerks printing process. When printing first begins, it will start at the top of the first page. The first section that's eligible for printing is always Report Header 1 if it exists. If it exists, it's checked for a filter. If no filter exists, the section is printed. If a filter does exist, the condition is checked to see if it has been met. If the filter condition has been met, the section is printed. If the filter condition has not been met, the section is skipped. Once the printing process has determined whether or not to print Report Header 1, it moves on to the next section. If another report header section exists, it will be evaluated in the exact same way. It is possible to have multiple report header sections and print all of them, none of them, or some of them. After the report headers, the printing process moves on to the first printing of the page header. The page header section does have a filter too, but it cannot be used to choose between different headers because only one page header section can be defined. So if the filter's criteria are met or no filter is defined, the page header is printed. Note that several different settings affect the spacing between sections, but we'll talk more about that later. Next up are the detail sections. To understand what's going on here, first think about the line items on our quote. The printing process will cycle through those line items one at a time. For each line item, the printing process will then evaluate each detail section and the filter criteria. For each detail section where the criteria has been met, the line item will be printed in the manner defined by that detail section. Yes, that does mean the same line item from our quote can be printed on the document multiple times if the criteria for multiple sections has been met. After the line item has been processed through each detail section, the printing process moves on to the next line item and cycles back through all of the detail sections again. While the detail sections are being printed one line item at a time, eventually the first page will fill up. When the printing process reaches the bottom of a page, the page footer section will be printed even if more line items need to be printed. Much like the page header, only one page footer can be defined on the print layout, but it does still have a filter that can control whether it's printed or not. If the bottom of a page is reached and the filter criteria for the page footer has been met, the page footer is printed. Since the page footer is only printed at the end of a page, it will be immediately followed by a new page. As we discussed earlier, the page header section is printed at the top of every page, so it will be printed next at the very top of the next page, assuming its filter criteria has still been met. After the page header has been printed on the new page, printing of the line items through the detail sections will resume. After the printing process has cycled through all of the line items, it will be at the end of the report, where it will evaluate the report footer sections. Like the report header, multiple report footer sections can be defined on the layout, and each can have filter criteria. Each report footer will be evaluated, and if the filter criteria have been met, it is printed. And finally, the page footer is printed one last time on the final page. The printing process can get a little more advanced with a cover page or attached PDF files, spec sheets, or literature, but this is the core process followed on every print job. Now that we understand the different sections on the layout, let's take a look at the elements that we can add to them. Within each section, we can define a variety of different fields. We have data fields, which allow us to refer to individual data elements within the QuoteWerks document. We have system fields that allow us to refer to environmental data elements like date time, record count, and page count. We have formula fields, which will allow us to build expressions that involve many different values or other fields. We have dialog fields, which will allow us to prompt the user for manual input before the document is printed. We have labels, which are fields with static text, usually used to label other fields. We have lines, which are simply dividing lines used to enhance the aesthetics of the document. And we have picture fields, which are used for displaying static images, usually a company logo or other branding graphics. Note that this field is different from the product pictures that may be associated with product line items on the document. Now that we understand the parts of the layout and the printing process, let's look over the rest of the features in the Layout Designer and see how they can help us build our layouts. On the toolbar, we have a number of buttons. The Save button will save our changes on the current layout. The Save and Preview button will save our changes on the current layout and print the current QuoteWerks document on the current layout and display it for our review. The Save and Close button will save our changes on the current print layout and also close the Layout Designer. The Close button will close the Layout Designer and return us to the QuoteWerks environment. If changes need to be saved, we will be prompted to save the layout first. The Field button allows us to insert a data field into the layout. The Label button allows us to insert a new label field into the layout. The Line button allows us to insert a new line object into the layout. The Picture button allows us to insert a new picture object into the layout using a static picture. The Section button allows us to add a new section to the layout. The Formula button allows us to define and add a new formula field to the layout. The System button allows us to insert a new system field into the layout. The Dialog button allows us to insert an existing dialog field into the layout. At least one dialog field must have been defined before using this button. Also note that this field will display the user's input. The Font button allows us to update the font settings of a selected element in the layout. The Alignment button allows us to update the alignment settings of a selected element in the layout. The Borders button allows us to update the border settings of a selected element in the layout. And the Color button allows us to update the color settings of a selected element in the layout. In the drop-down menus, we have many of the same options, and then quite a few more. The File and Edit menus both contain relatively standard features and options. Under File, we have Save to save our changes to the current layout, Save As to save the current layout under a new layout file name, Save and Close to save our changes and then close the layout designer, Save and Preview to save our changes and then print the current QuoteWerks document on the current layout and display it for our review. Printer Setup will allow us to specify the printer to print on, the paper size, and the orientation. And finally, we have Close to close the layout designer. Under Edit, we have the Undo option to undo the most recent change to the layout, Cut to cut the currently selected element to the Windows clipboard, Copy to copy the selected element to the Windows clipboard, Paste to paste into the layout from the Windows clipboard, Delete to delete the selected element. We have Edit Label to edit the text of a currently selected label field, Edit Formula field to allow us to edit the formula of a currently selected formula field, and Snap to Grid, where we can toggle the Snap to Grid feature and adjust the size of the grid spacing. The Insert menu is used to select new elements to add to our layout. We can choose Data Field to add a new data field to the layout, System Field to add a new system field to the layout, Formula Field to create and define a new formula field and then add it to the layout, Dialog Field to add an existing dialog field to the layout. Note that the field must have already been created under the Report menu and that this field is used to display the input that was provided by the user. We can also choose Label to add a new label to the layout, Line to add a new line to the layout, and Picture to add a new picture field to the layout. Again, note that this is a static picture field and is not the same picture field that may be associated with certain products on the quote. The Format menu has many options, but their availability is largely based on the kind of element that is currently selected. We can choose Font to update the font settings of a selected element, Conditional Font to apply a conditional font to the selected element, Alignment to update the alignment settings of the selected element, Borders to change the borders around the selected element, Background Color to update the background color and shading style of the selected element. We can choose Center in Report, which will center the selected element within the width of the layout. We can choose Set as Active Style, which will designate the currently selected element as the template for formatting the style of new objects as they are inserted. We can choose Set as Active Field Properties, which will designate the currently selected element as the template for setting the properties and attributes of new fields as they are inserted. We can choose Apply Active Item Style, which will apply the currently defined active style to the currently selected element. We can choose Apply Active Field Properties, which will apply the currently defined active field properties to the currently selected element. And then we can choose Field to open the format dialog for a currently selected field, Label to open the format dialog for a currently selected label, Line to open the format dialog for a currently selected line, and Section to open the format dialog for a currently selected section. The section menu includes options for creating and deleting report sections. We can choose New to create new sections, Delete to delete a selected section, or Filter to set filter criteria for a selected section. Sort fields and break fields are specifically used for management reports and are not used in print layouts, so we won't discuss them today. The report menu gives us a variety of global settings. With named fonts, we can create, edit, or delete font settings that can then be used in the definition of conditional fonts. Under conditional fonts, we can create, edit, delete, or rename conditional fonts. Conditional fonts can be applied to fields so that styling can be based on some criteria instead of just static and predefined. Under dialog fields, we can create, edit, or delete dialog fields so we can prompt the user for input before a document is printed. Note that we define dialog fields here to start collecting input from the user. The user will begin seeing the prompts even if we don't place the dialog field anywhere on the layout. Under Size, we have 4 options that provide a quick, convenient way for moving elements around to create or compress space between them. And Options will open the Report Options dialog, which gives us a variety of global settings that relate to the entire printed document, including the print layout title, margins, date formats, and some header, footer, and printing options. Finally, the Arrange menu provides a variety of features to help us perfect the spacing and alignment of our fields and other elements. These features should be used when multiple elements have been selected. Under Align, these options will allow us to set the position of all selected elements by matching the specified edge or center line of each element to that of the last selected element. Selecting Top Edge will move every selected element so that the top edge matches that of the last element that was selected. Under Spacing, these options will allow us to set the position of all selected elements by making the space between them, either horizontally or vertically, match the space between the first 2 elements to be selected. Under Sizing, these options will allow us to set the size of all selected elements, either width or height, to the size of the last selected element. We also have a few other handy features around the design window. We have vertical and horizontal rulers that can help us perfect the sizing, positioning, and alignment of fields when working with them by hand. We also have a status bar at the very bottom, which will give us some feedback about the selected element. It will tell us the type of field selected and the name of the field, as well as some information about the size and position. Specifically, it will tell us the top left position of the field and its width and height. We've covered all of the features in the Layout Designer interface, so let's take another look at some of those formatting options. First, we'll look at how we can format elements like labels and data fields. Labels have 3 formatting options available. We can change the orientation to vertical instead of horizontal, we can set the label to invisible, and we can make the label a hyperlink. If the text of the label is a properly formatted web address, it will be a functional, clickable hyperlink in the exported PDF file. Formatting options for data fields depends on the type of data field selected. For a text field like DocNo, We have options for controlling text wrapping, controlling capitalization, and for trimming extra spaces. We also have options to make the data field invisible and to make it a hyperlink, just like labels. For a date data field, like DocDate, we have options for controlling the conventions of the date and the time, as well as the ability to make the field disappear if there is no value. For a number field, like unit price, we have settings for controlling the decimal places available, settings for suppressing zeros or padding with zeros. We can turn on using the standard comma thousand separator. We also have control over prefixes and suffixes that are used to represent positive and negative values, and we can set a currency symbol to represent monetary figures. Formatting options for formula fields will be one of these three sets of options, depending on the type of value returned by the formula. When formatting sections in the Layout Designer, we have very different options. We have options to force starting a new page before or after printing this section. We can also crop any extra empty space just above or below this section. When formatting a detail section, we can also allow line items to be written to multiple side-by-side columns instead of only one per line. We can also use the Keep with Next Detail Section setting to designate that two detail sections must always appear together on the same page. This could be used to ensure that product discount line items always appear on the same page as the product line item that they refer to. Similarly, we can use the Keep Together setting to prevent splitting one detail section across pages. When using this setting, if a detail section will not fit in the space remaining on the page, printing will advance to a new page first. Finally, we can use the Print on Page Break feature to create a detail section that will print when a page is filled up, but before the page footer prints. This section will always appear in between the last line item and the page footer. Now let's look a little more at inserting fields and the options we'll have to consider. When inserting data fields, we can choose nearly any piece of data from the QuoteWerks environment. We can choose from 4 tables of data. The quote details not related to line items, like the quote number, customer address, and tax rate, will be in the document headers table. The quote details related to line items, like quantity, description, and unit price, will be in the document items table. Information from the QuoteWerks installation, things like sales rep contact information, will be in the application table, and details pulled from an integrated CRM will be available in the contact manager table. When inserting a new formula field, we'll have to give it a name, and then we can construct a formula expression using the 6 insert buttons available at the bottom. This topic is covered in much more detail in a separate video on using formulas in the QuoteWerks Layout Designer. In order to insert a dialog field, we have to create one first. So we'll go to Report, Dialog Fields, and choose New. We'll have to give it a name, and then we specify the field type to indicate the kind of data that we intend to collect from the user. We can choose text to collect any sort of text values. We can choose numeric to collect whole numbers from the user. We can choose double to collect decimal numbers. We can choose logical to collect true, false, or yes, no responses from the user. And we can choose date to collect date values from the user. Note that just creating the field is enough to start prompting the user for data. But if we haven't placed it anywhere on the layout, the response won't be used for anything. Once the field exists, we can set a few more properties and then place it on the layout. So we'll edit the dialog field, where we can change the prompt that is presented to the user. If we have more than one dialog field, We can control the order that they're presented in by changing the prompt order. We can control the number of characters allowed in the response by changing the field width. And we can set an initial default value for the user. Finally, we can insert it into our layout. And we can see the results of our dialog field presented in the report header. Thank you for taking the time to review the QuoteWerks Layout Designer with us. We've looked over the Layout Designer's interface, the parts of a print layout, the printing process, the various formatting options available when building a layout, and the basics of inserting and setting up a new field in a print layout. Be sure to check out our additional videos on using formula fields and more advanced techniques in the QuoteWerks Layout Designer.